Alright, so y'all go ahead and do the factoring and the math knowledge question for today. Pause the video, and then once everyone is finished, you can unpause the video and I'll go over the correct answers. So for the factoring, you're going to want two numbers that multiply to give you 32 and add to give you 12. So the numbers that multiply to give you 32 are 1 and 32, which don't add to give you 12. 2 and 16. If you add those, they don't equal 12. 3 doesn't work. 4 and 8 does work. If you add those do equal 12. So you're going to have x plus 4 times x plus 8. And this one was a little bit easier than the one yesterday because they were both positives. So we knew that we had to have two numbers that were both positive. For the math knowledge question, we are looking for the length of arc AB. And it tells us it's an equilateral triangle. So that means that this arc length, and this arc length are all the same. So the circumference is going to be divided by 3 for the arc length of A to B. Our circumference is found from 2 pi times your radius. And they said the radius is just r. So we divide that by 3, and that gives us this length here. So 2 pi r over 3 is A, and so that would be your answer. So we're looking at lesson 2 today. We're dealing with segments. So hopefully after this lesson you'll understand how segments work. So a line segment is part of a line consisting of two endpoints and all points between them. So if we have AB for our line segment, the way that you write that is AB with a line bar over it. There are no arrows on the ends of it. This is a line, so it would look like this, whereas AB is only the portion that is in between A and B. So that's the difference between a line segment and just a line. If you have congruent, that means that the objects have the same shape and size. So congruent means exact same shape and size. Congruent segments are two segments that have the same length. So segment AB is equal to segment CD because they both have a length of 5. A congruent statement shows that two segments are congruent. And so if I wanted to say that segment AB is congruent to segment CD, the symbol for congruent looks like that. It's an equal with a little squiggle above it. So you could write segment AB is congruent to segment CD with the little bars above them. Congruent segments are shown with tick marks typically. So instead of it saying 5 and 5, it would show two segments with a tick mark. And that means that they are congruent because they both have one tick mark. So if this one had a second tick mark, it would not be congruent to this one because they have different number of tick marks. So that's how you can tell based on tick marks if they are congruent. Now we're going to look at some properties that apply to all congruent segments. The reflexive property just tells you that AB is congruent to AB. It's the exact same thing. It is congruent to itself. The symmetric property of congruence tells you that if AB is congruent to CD, then CD is congruent to AB. And you have probably used this without even realizing it. When you solve in algebra, you may have gotten 3 equals x, but on your test you put x equals 3. You use the symmetric property of congruence. Same thing, which means that you can flip them around. And then the transitive property, if AB is congruent to CD and CD is congruent to EF, then that means that AB has to be congruent to EF. And that's called the transitive property of congruence. so you may have used this before. X is equal to y and y equals 3, then that means that x has to equal 3. So that's a transitive property. You definitely have to learn the difference between these three. So if y'all need to pause the video and write them down, you can. But you have to learn reflexive, symmetric, and transitive properties of congruence. So we want to identify the property that justifies each statement. So for the first one, Fn is congruent to Fn. Which statement are we going, which property are we going to use for this statement? Hopefully you said the reflexive property of congruence. For the next one, Fn is congruent to Mn, and Mn is congruent to Jk. So that means that Fn is congruent to Jk. Which property would we use for that one? Hopefully you said transitive property of congruence. And then for the last one, it says Fn is congruent to Nf. So which property is that? Now this is not identical to what's on the other side. Fn, this is not Fn. So this is not the reflexive property. This is going to be the symmetric property of congruence. So you need to make sure that you learn them and you know exactly which property goes with your statements. They're going to be used a lot throughout the year. Now we're going to look at postulates. We are going to have, I think it's 21 postulates that we'll go through throughout the year. Not all of them right now, but throughout the whole year, I think we will have 21 postulates. And so a postulate is just a statement that is accepted as true without proof. So there's no actual proof for postulates. We will look at theorems, and those are going to be ones that do have a proof. Postulates, we can't prove them, but we do take them as true. So far, they have not been able to be disproven. So the first postulate we're going to look at has a name, and it's called the ruler postulate. Now this says postulate number 1. If you go to another textbook, it's probably not going to have the same postulate number 1. And that's because this is just the first postulate that the book has introduced. So don't get hung up on learning that it's postulate number 1. Learn that it's the ruler postulate. Now not all of them have names, and so if you want to know that it's postulate number 1, you can refer to it as that, but it's really more important to know that it's the ruler postulate. So what it says, the points on a line can be paired in a one-to-one correspondence with the real numbers such that any two given points can have coordinates 0 and 1. And then the distance between the 2 points is the absolute value of the difference of their coordinates. And so we're going to do an example to show how to use the ruler postulate in just a second. Distance is always the measure connecting 2 points, and it's always positive. If you say that you're going to drive to West Monroe, you may go 15 miles, 10 miles, 5 miles, whatever it is. You're never going to say, oh, I went -7 miles today. Even if you backed up, your car odometer is still going to be going up. It's never going to start decreasing. So distance is always going to be positive. So looking here, we're going to use the ruler postulate to find the distance between A and B. And so basically, you can just count on these, or you can find the difference between 3 and 5 and take the absolute value of it. So from A to B, 3 minus 5 is -2, but the absolute value of that is 2. So that would be the distance from A to B. Going from B to C, well, B is 3 minus, what is the point for C? It is a -5, and so you actually end up adding those. 3 plus 5 becomes an 8. And if you had counted over, you would get to 8. If you're going from C to D, we could do -5 and then minus a -1. So again, that turns to a positive. And so the distance between C and D is 4. And then going from A to C, or we can do A first. A is 5, and then minus a -5. So add those together, and you get 10. And if you pick to do, like on this last one, we could have done -5 minus 5. That's a -10. Absolute value of that is still 10. It doesn't matter which point you start with. You're just looking for how far apart are they. So looking at the next postulate. Postulate number 2 is called the segment addition postulate. And again, this is not important to know that it's postulate number 2. It's more important to know it's the segment addition postulate. So if we have points A and C, and point B is somewhere in between them, then the segment from A to B plus the segment from B to C has to equal the whole part from A to C. So if we went from Monroe to Ruston and then to Shreveport, the distance between Monroe and Ruston, let's say, is 40 miles. And then the distance between Ruston and Shreveport is, we'll say 80 miles. I have no idea. The total would be 120. And there you go. That's how you use the segment addition postulate. It's not terribly difficult. Alright, so we have points E, R, and T are collinear with R in between E and T. So you want to draw this out, and it doesn't have to be to scale. But we know that R is in between E and T. And it tells us that the whole segment ET is 13.7. And TR is 2.5. We want to find ER. So we start off with our equation. We know that ER plus RT has to equal E to T. So we don't know ER, that's what we're looking for. But we know that the length of TR, or RT, is 2.5. And we know that the length of ET is 13.7. So if you subtract the distance between ER, it's going to be 11.2. And so that would be your answer for A. For part B, we're going to do the same concept. So we have segment JX plus segment XK, and together they make up segment JK. So segment JX was F minus 1, segment XK was F plus 1, and together they make up JK. So if you add these together, we are going to have 2F, and then the -1 and the +1 cancel out, and so that equals JK. So that would be your answer for that one. Looking at midpoint now. The midpoint is just the point that divides a segment into two congruent parts. It's the halfway point. So if we have this point here and this point here, the midpoint between A and B, if I put it here, it's going to make this part and this part congruent to each other. So meet halfway in between, you're going to meet at the midpoint. So a train travels from A to B to C, and B is halfway between A and C. How far is it from town B to town A? So what is the distance from A to B? Well, it says that B is the midpoint, so that means that this, or it says it's halfway between, which means it's the midpoint. So these two segments have to be congruent. So we're just going to take our total distance and divide it by 2. And so 14.2 divided by 2 is going to be 7.1. And so we just have 7.1 miles for the answer. So now we're going to look at some practice problems. So again, I want y'all to pause the video on these and try them by yourself, and then unpause the video and we can go over them. So identify the property that justifies the statement. JK or KL is congruent to MN, so MN is congruent to KL. That is going to be the symmetric property of congruence. Find the distance between the points A and B. So point A is -4, and then minus point B, which is 3. So -4 minus 3 is -7. So the absolute value of that is 7. Okay. For finding AC in terms of x, we know that AB plus BC is going to equal AC. So AB was x squared minus x plus 3. And then BC is 2x plus 7. But we want to combine any like terms that we have. So that would make it x squared plus x plus 10. And so that would be your answer for that one. For part D, how many miles is the midpoint from either city? Well, the total distance between the two is 811. And to find the midpoint, you're just going to divide by 2. So 811 divided by 2 is 405.5. So 405.5 miles would be your answer. So hopefully you were able to get most of those right. We're going to look at our challenge question for today. So y'all read through this, pause the video and think about it, and then unpause the video and I'll go over it. So we want to draw a line segment and a point between the endpoints. So there's my line segment. And we put a point in between them. Got a point X there. Compare the distances between the point and each of the two endpoints. So this one is much smaller than the distance over here. And if we shift the plotted point along the segment, how do the two distances change? Well, if I move point X over to here, now this segment is longer than this one. So as the point is moved closer to one endpoint, the distance between that endpoint and the point is going to decrease, and the distance between the point and the other endpoint is going to increase. And if the plotted point gets moved so that it's onto one of the endpoints, like it is on top of A or B, then that distance will become 0, and the other distance between point X and the other endpoint is going to be equal to the original segment. So that's how they would be changed and compared. So your homework for tonight is 1 through 30. Make sure that y'all do those so that we can go over any questions tomorrow.